3 days ago I was an unemployed 26-year-old who fell asleep reading a trashy web novel called The Villainess Dies at Dawn. I woke up in the body of Desmond Cray, the novel's designated punching bag, the trash husband whose entire narrative function was to be humiliated, discarded, and eventually murdered off-page around chapter 40 so the real hero could swoop in and comfort the grieving heroine. For those first 3 days I did what I assume anyone would do. I panicked quietly, catalogued everything I could remember about the plot, and tried to figure out how much time I had before the walls of the story closed in around me. I remembered the broad strokes well enough. I'd binged all 400-odd chapters over a bad week 2 winters ago, but the finer details had gone soft with time, the way details do. I remembered that Lucy Whitmore was hated by everyone who mattered, that her own family was quietly working to destroy her, and that the book treated her ruin as a form of entertainment for its readers. I remembered that Desmond hated her too, or was written to, in the flat, dutiful way side characters hate people in stories that don't actually care about them. I remembered he divorced her out of cowardice around chapter 30, and that the divorce didn't save him from anything. Nothing in that book saved anyone who wasn't the hero. What I didn't remember, what I only worked out sitting at Desmond's kitchen table at 2 in the morning, scrolling through his phone with shaking hands, was how close I already was to the accident. The date on his phone matched a chapter I half recalled the shape of. I had maybe 6 hours warning, if that, and I spent most of them trying to convince myself I'd misremembered, right up until the headline actually scrolled across my screen and I stopped being able to lie to myself. Desmond's wife was Lucy Whitmore. In the book she wasn't the heroine. She was the villainous, cold, ruthless, universally despised, and, according to the author, thoroughly deserving of the slow, article-by-article dismantling of her empire that made up the back half of the story. Chapter 1 of that dismantling was a car accident on Route 9 that crippled her and blinded her in one eye, courtesy of sabotage ordered by her own baby brother. The original Desmond, 3 months into their sham marriage and already resentful of being nothing more than a stepping stone for the Whitmore family's political ambitions, was supposed to hear about the crash on the news and feel nothing. Relief, if anything. I did not feel nothing. I had spent 3 days inside this man's life, his cramped apartment above a dry cleaner's, his half-finished divorce papers sitting untouched in a drawer, his diary full of small, ordinary bitterness about being talked over in board meetings he wasn't even invited to, and I had come to a simple, panicked conclusion: I did not want to die at chapter 40. And in this story, everyone who stood between Lucy Whitmore and her ruin ended up dead. Desmond was supposed to divorce her out of cowardice and get stabbed in an alley 3 chapters later by a hitman cleaning up loose ends. That was his entire arc: coward, then corpse. So when I saw the headline scroll across my phone that afternoon, Whitmore heiress involved in single vehicle collision, Route 9, I didn't think about relief. I thought about the timeline. In the book, help arrived 19 minutes after the crash. Lucy spent those 19 minutes trapped in a burning car with a steel rod through her thigh, and the fire investigator later ruled that a faster extraction would have saved her leg and her eye both. I grabbed the emergency hammer that came with the car, Desmond's meager, forgotten car, the one Lucy's family mocked him for driving, and I drove like a lunatic toward Route 9. 2. The wreck looked worse in person than any paragraph had prepared me for. No sentence in that book had bothered to describe the smell, hot metal and gasoline, and something underneath it that I didn't want to name, or the sound, a low ticking groan from somewhere inside the engine block, like the car itself was still deciding whether to give up entirely. Her sedan had gone off the shoulder and folded itself around a guardrail post, and smoke was already curling up from under the crushed hood in thin, oily ribbons that were going to be flame within minutes. I knew that because I'd read it, once, as entertainment, lying on a couch with a bag of chips balanced on my chest, and I hated myself a little for that now in a way I didn't have time to sit with. I parked crooked, ran, and found her pinned behind a door that wouldn't give, blood already soaking through her blouse at the abdomen and darkening one leg of her trousers black. Up close she looked younger than I'd pictured her. The book had spent 400 chapters describing her as icy, imperious, untouchable, and none of those words survived contact with a 28-year-old woman trapped in a crumpled car, sheet white, trying very hard not to make a sound. She turned her head when she heard me, and her expression did something I wasn't prepared for. Not relief. Terror. I understood a half-second later. In the book, Desmond hated her. Everyone who read The Villainess Dies at Dawn understood that Desmond hated her. She had no reason to think the man swinging a hammer at her door had come to help. "Stop looking at me like that," I said, hearing my own voice come out higher and shakier than I wanted. The hammer rang uselessly off the window frame, missing the safety corner twice before I found it. "Save your strength. Keep breathing. Don't you dare die on me." She didn't answer. She couldn't, really. She was too busy trying to wrench her own seat belt loose with hands that kept slipping in her own blood, but her eyes never left my face, and I understood that particular flavor of terror because I'd read about it from the inside of a book. This is the man who benefits most from my death, and he is standing over me with a hammer. The glass finally spidered and gave. I dropped the hammer, wrenched the door the rest of the way open, and got my arms under her before she could argue. "The files," she said immediately, thin and strained. "They're in the back seat. I need them." "Are you serious right now? They're worth more than my leg." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her eyes stayed flat, calculating, already 3 moves ahead even with the rod through her thigh. "Get them or leave me." "I mean it." I carried her to my car first. I wasn't about to negotiate that part, but the fire under the hood of her sedan was climbing, and something in her face when she said they're worth more than my leg told me she wasn't posturing. So once she was in my passenger seat, pressing her own hand hard against her thigh, I did the single dumbest thing I have ever done in either of my 2 lives and ran back toward a car that was actively trying to become a bomb. I found the folder wedged half under the driver's seat, blood slicked at one corner, and I was maybe 4 steps clear of the wreck when it went up behind me. The blast wave put me on the pavement face first, and for a few seconds the world was just a white ringing nothing. When I could see again, I was lying in the road with my ears screaming and my palms scraped raw, and through the smoke I could see Lucy in my passenger seat, both hands pressed to her leg, staring at me like she genuinely could not decide whether I was alive. I got up. I always seem to get up. I spat blood onto the asphalt, picked up the folder, and walked back like a man auditioning for the role of someone who does this sort of thing every day. "Oh my God," I said, dropping into the driver's seat, hands shaking too hard to get the key in on the first try. "That was way worse than a roller coaster." She looked at me. Blood ran from a cut above her eyebrow and down the line of her jaw, and even half collapsed against the seat. Even with her hands slick and red at her thigh, her eyes were sharp as broken glass. "Are you insane?" she said, not a question. "Or did you actually think I'd thank you?" "I think you'll bleed to death if I sit here debating your opinion of me," I said, and pulled us onto the road. She didn't lose consciousness, which I understood even then was less a mercy than a warning. Every few seconds her breath hitched sharp and shallow, and every time it did, her free hand, the one not pressed to her thigh, tightened around the folder in her lap like it was the only thing keeping the rest of her assembled. I drove faster than I'd ever driven in either of my lives, running 2 lights I had no memory of afterward, and somewhere around the second one she spoke again, quieter this time, like she was talking herself through something rather than talking to me. "If this is a trick," she said, "if you're driving me somewhere quiet instead of the hospital because it's easier to finish the job somewhere without cameras, I want you to know I already called it in. Before you got the door open. There's a location ping on my phone and a message half-typed to my head of security that just says your name and the mile marker." Her eyes cut sideways to me, glassy with pain but still working, still calculating. "So if I disappear, you won't?" I almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about how carefully she'd thought that through with the rod in her leg and the car on fire behind her. "Good," I said instead. Keep thinking like that. It'll keep you alive a lot longer than trusting me will. That seemed to settle something in her, oddly not comfort exactly, but a kind of grim satisfaction, like I'd passed some test I hadn't known I was taking. She didn't speak again until the hospital lights came into view, and when she did, it was only to say, faster, which I already was. 3. In the original book, Chapter 1 ends with Lucy surviving the crash through sheer stubbornness and her brother's hired men finishing the job at the hospital 3 chapters later, while blind in one eye and unable to walk without a cane, unable to see it coming. I did not know if her brother's men were already moving. I only knew that the ambulance in the book arrived 19 minutes too late, and I intended to beat that number by a wide margin. I did. I got her to the hospital doors in 11, laying on the horn until an ambulance crew waiting for a different call turned and saw us and came running instead. They had her on a stretcher and moving before I'd even gotten the car in park. Family, a nurse said, already jogging alongside the gurney, and before I could think better of it I said, husband, which was, on paper, technically true, and shoved Desmond's card at her. No pin needed. Use whatever she needs. All of it? The nurse's eyebrows went up. The Whitmore family's contempt for Desmond wasn't exactly a secret in this town, but she took the card and ran. Lucy caught my sleeve before they took her through the doors, her grip weaker than her voice. Scared I'll die. A ghost of something that might have been mockery, might have been genuine curiosity, crossed her bloodied face. If I die, you're a widower. Convenient. If you die, I said, matching her flat tone because it seemed like the only language she trusted, you're taking me with you. So don't. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or suspicion recalibrating itself, and then the doors swallowed her and I was left standing in a waiting room full of strangers whose phones would not stop ringing. I didn't know most of them. Whitmore lawyers, Whitmore security, a cousin or two who kept glancing at me like I was something unpleasant they'd stepped in. But I recognized one face immediately, and it made the back of my neck go cold. A lean, unbothered man in his early 30s, leaning against the far wall with his phone in one hand and an expression that was working very hard to look like concern and not quite managing it. Julian Whitmore. Lucy's younger brother. The man who, in the book, had paid a mechanic to loosen a bolt on her brake line, and who spent the rest of the story quietly consolidating everything she lost. He wasn't looking at the emergency room doors the way everyone else was. He was looking at his phone, thumb moving in short, unhurried taps, like a man updating a spreadsheet rather than waiting on news of his sister's survival. When he did glance up, once, it wasn't toward the doors, it was toward me, a brief, assessing flick of the eyes that lasted less than a second and told me everything I needed to know about how this book intended its side characters to be handled. I looked away first, on purpose, because the last thing I wanted was to convince a man like that I was worth paying attention to before I had any leverage at all. I kept my mouth shut after that and my eyes mostly on the floor, because in the book this was exactly the kind of scene where somebody's loose end got tied off quietly in a corridor, and I had no intention of being caught flat-footed twice in one day. Every few minutes a nurse would come through with a clipboard and Julian would straighten up just enough to look appropriately worried before slouching back against the wall the moment she passed. Nobody else in the room seemed to notice. I noticed. I filed it away the way I'd started filing away everything else since I woke up in this body, not as gossip, but as ammunition I might need later and couldn't afford to forget. A nurse burst back through the doors 40 minutes in, shouting for the blood bank, and my legs actually did buckle a little before I caught myself. Hemorrhagic shock. I knew that phrase from the book too. It was the exact phrase used the night Lucy nearly died the first time, in the original timeline, when the transfusion came from a stranger named Tom who'd shown up out of nowhere with the right blood type and later turned out to be the actual hero of the story, the one who'd eventually replace Desmond in every sense of the word. Lucy had a rare type. Rh negative. So, as it happened, did Desmond, and I'd absorbed that fact along with everything else in his diary, A small useless trivia entry from a routine physical that I now understood was the most important sentence in the entire book. "The blood bank's short," the nurse said, scanning the waiting room like she was already resigned to the answer. "We need a donor, now." "I'm Rh negative," I said, already rolling my sleeve up. "Use mine." She looked at me for exactly 1 second, long enough to decide I wasn't lying, and then had me by the arm, pulling me toward the donation room before I'd finished the sentence. I gave more than I should have. I remember the room tilting a little near the end and a technician telling me to lie back, her voice going soft and far away the way sound does right before your body decides it's had enough. I remember thinking, with the particular clarity that arrives right before you pass out, that somewhere in another version of this exact hour a man named Tom Aldrich was supposed to be sitting in this chair instead of me, that the book had written the scene for him, had built an entire romance out of it, the stranger with the right blood type appearing out of nowhere to save the woman everyone else had given up on. Not this time, I thought, and the thought felt stubborn and a little unhinged and entirely mine. This one's mine. I woke up on a cot in a side room 20 minutes later with a juice box taped to my hand and a headache like a spike behind my eye, and the first thing I did, before I even remembered my own name properly, was ask a passing nurse if Lucy Whitmore was still in surgery. She was. I made her tell me twice. 3B. Julian found me in the hallway outside the donation room, still gray-faced and holding my juice box like a lifeline. He'd clearly been waiting. "Desmond." He said my name like he was trying out a word in a language he didn't respect. "Didn't peg you for the heroic type." "People contain multitudes," I said, and immediately regretted how much it sounded like something Desmond's diary would never have said. Julian's eyebrows twitched. He'd noticed too. "They usually don't," he said. "In my experience, people contain exactly what's convenient for them, and nothing more." He tucked his phone into his pocket, unhurried, and looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog that had unexpectedly bitten a burglar, reassessing, not grateful. "You gave blood. Went back into a burning car for a folder. Paid for a private room out of an account I happen to know has $11 in it." A thin smile. "I'm curious what you think that buys you, exactly." So he'd been watching the account. Of course he had. In the book, Julian had spent years quietly starving Desmond's finances, specifically so that when the divorce came, Desmond would have no leverage to negotiate with, just enough rope to hang himself and no more. I felt something cold and clear settle into place in my chest, the first genuinely useful thought I'd had all night. "It buys me nothing," I said. "I didn't do it for currency. You clearly did the math on that account balance and decided I couldn't possibly have a reason that wasn't transactional. That's on you, not me." "Careful," Julian said softly, and for just a second the bored, unbothered mask slipped enough that I saw something genuinely unpleasant underneath it. "My sister has a habit of collecting strays who think they've become indispensable. It never ends well for the strays." "Funny," I said. "She said something almost exactly like that about you, 20 minutes before the car went off the road." It wasn't true. I had no idea what Lucy thought of her brother. But I watched the sentence land, watched the practiced calm on Julian's face flicker for just an instant before he smoothed it back into place, and I understood I'd found a nerve without even trying very hard. He didn't say anything else. He straightened his cuffs, gave me a smile with absolutely nothing behind it, and walked away down the corridor with his phone already back out, thumbs moving. I stood there with my juice box shaking slightly in my hand and thought, whatever happens next, that man is not going to make this easy. Then I went back to the waiting room, because Lucy was still in surgery and I had nowhere else in the entire world I wanted to be. 4. Dawn was coming up gray through the waiting room windows when the doors finally opened. I'd been sitting with my head between my knees for an hour, seeing stars every time I tried to stand, and when the surgeon came out and said the words stable and good prognosis, I put my face in my hands and did not care who saw me shake. They moved her to a private recovery suite on the 4th floor. I followed on legs that felt like wet rope, riding the high of she's alive, she's alive. I actually did it right up until 2 men in black suits stepped in front of the door and informed me, politely and immovably, that I could not go in. "I'm her husband," I said. "I need to see her." Ma'am's orders were specific. One of them said, not unkindly, the way you'd explain a rule to a child. "Family visits are being screened." Screened. Meaning, not me. Meaning that even after everything, in this family's eyes I was still Desmond Cray, the discount husband, worth less than the wallpaper. I felt something in me go stubborn and mean. "Fine," I said. "Then tell her I'm about to burn the files I pulled out of her burning car for her. See how fast that gets screened out." Both bodyguards' faces changed at once, and one of them actually reached for me like he meant to physically shut me up, which told me everything I needed to know about how much those files were worth. And then, from somewhere past the door, low and controlled even through a wall, a voice said, "Let him in." I have read 100 bad novels that describe a voice as making someone's knees go weak, and I always thought it was lazy writing. It is not lazy writing. It happened to me, in a hospital hallway, at 6 in the morning, on no sleep and half a pint short of blood. It was the first time I'd heard Lucy Whitmore's voice without pain or panic distorting it, and it was low and clear and utterly without apology, and something in my chest did an undignified little drop. The bodyguard stepped aside. I straightened my spine, put on the most convincing sneer Desmond's face could manage, and walked in like I owned the place and then stopped dead just inside the door, because Lucy wasn't alone. There was a man in the visitor's chair beside her bed. Mid-30s, expensive suit even at this hour, a face I recognized immediately and with a lurch of pure dread, because I had read 300 pages about it. Tom Aldrich. The novel's actual male lead. The man who was supposed to be at her bedside donating blood, holding her hand, becoming indispensable, and instead he was sitting there watching me with an expression I couldn't read at all, while Lucy, pale and bandaged and propped against 3 pillows, looked back and forth between the two of us with the sharp, assessing calm of someone recalculating an entire chessboard in real time. "Well," Tom said slowly, into the silence. "This is new." V. Nobody moved for a second that felt much longer than a second. I understood, with the sinking clarity of a man watching his careful plans meet a wall, that Tom's presence here was not in the script, or rather, it was exactly in the script, just 3 chapters ahead of schedule, because in the book Tom didn't meet Lucy until the blood transfusion scene, and I had just personally, single-handedly, erased that scene from existence by rolling up my own sleeve. So why was he here? "You," Lucy said, and her voice when she said it to Tom was courteous in a way it had never once been courteous to me. Cool, professional, the voice of someone greeting a business acquaintance, not a future love interest. I wasn't expecting Whitmore Capital's newest board nominee to make hospital visits personally. Board nominee. Not a stranger with the right blood type who falls in love with her over a transfusion bag. A corporate rival, or a corporate ally, walking in through the front door on his own 2 feet, for his own reasons, because the crash, my rescue, my timeline had scrambled the order of every domino in this story. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. "I heard about the accident an hour ago," Tom said smoothly, eyes flicking to me and back to her. "I came to make sure the paperwork on Thursday's vote wasn't compromised." I didn't realize a pause, deliberate, your husband would already be here. Ahead of everyone else's people, in fact. The way he said husband had an edge to it, testing, and I understood suddenly that in this room, in this scene, I was the variable nobody had accounted for. Not Tom. Me. "You keep unusually close tabs on my paperwork for a man who isn't on the board yet," Lucy said, and though her voice stayed even, I caught the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth, the look of someone filing away a data point she hadn't expected to need this early. "How, Exactly, did you hear about the accident within the hour? Route 9 isn't on any route your office would have reason to monitor. Tom's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated, quick and controlled, the way mine probably had a dozen times in the last 12 hours. I have people who flag anything involving Whitmore Capital, he said. It's due diligence, nothing more sinister than that. Lucy said, in precisely the same flat, unconvinced tone she'd used on me not an hour before, and I felt an entirely inappropriate flicker of solidarity at being on the correct side of that particular sound for once. Due diligence. I'll remember you said that. I stayed quiet through the exchange, mostly because I had nothing useful to add and partly because I was still trying to work out what it meant that Tom Aldrich, the book's actual hero, the man written to be adored, had walked into this room and immediately triggered the exact same wary, assessing stillness in Lucy that I'd spent the entire night trying to earn my way out from under. Whatever version of the story we were in now, it clearly wasn't handing anyone a script anymore. Not Tom. Not her. Not me. Lucy's eyes moved to me then, and for the first time since the crash there was no fear in them, no calculation aimed like a weapon, just a long, careful, unreadable study, the kind a person gives something they thought they'd already finished cataloging and have just discovered they got wrong. He pulled me out of a burning car, she said finally, still watching me, not Tom. Went back in for the files while it was on fire. Gave his own blood when the bank ran short. A beat. I've read his diary, you know. He's hated me since the wedding. Called me a leech in his own handwriting 3 separate times. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one working out whether it was allowed to exist. So somebody explained to me why the man who hates me most just spent his morning trying very hard to keep me alive. Every instinct honed by 3 days of reading myself into this man's skin told me the truth would end me faster than any hitman in a back alley. So I gave her the only thing I actually had, which inconveniently, infuriatingly turned out to also be the truth. I don't know when I stopped hating you, I said. Might have been somewhere between the hammer and the fire. I didn't exactly stop to journal about it. I nodded at Tom without quite looking at him. But I know I'm not interested in watching somebody else get credit for keeping you breathing. So if the two of you have business, I'll wait outside. If not, I'm not going anywhere. The room was quiet again, but it was a different quiet. Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lucy looked at me a moment longer, then reached, wincing, for the blood-stained folder still tucked under my arm. Give me the files, she said. And sit down before you fall down. You look like you're the one who needs the transfusion. I sat. Tom stood a moment later, unhurried, smoothing his jacket. I'll leave the vote paperwork with your assistant, he said to Lucy, and then, to me, with a thin, assessing smile that told me this was very far from over, Desmond, was it? I look forward to seeing more of you. He let himself out. The bodyguards closed the door behind him. Lucy exhaled slowly once he was gone, some of the careful posture leaving her shoulders, and looked at me over the top of the folder she hadn't yet opened. You're going to explain the diary entries eventually, she said. The leech comments specifically. There were 3. I counted. In my defense, I said, that man was an idiot. He, she said, is you. Was, I said. Was me. I'm workshopping a new personality. So far it mostly involves not letting you die, so early reviews are good. I paused, then added, because it seemed safer to get ahead of it than let her find it on her own. For what it's worth, I read the rest of the diary too. The parts that weren't about you. I wrote 3 entries a week for 2 years and never once mentioned a single friend by name. Just board meetings he wasn't invited to and a marriage he didn't understand. I'm not defending the leech comments. I'm telling you I understand, now, why a person that lonely might reach for the cheapest, meanest word available instead of doing the harder work of actually looking at you. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had lost some of its edge, though none of its precision. "That's either the most honest thing you've said all night," she said, "or the most calculated. I haven't decided which." "Ask me again in a week," I said. "I'm hoping the answer stays the same either way." Something crossed her face that I would spend the next several weeks trying and failing to properly name. Not quite a smile. Closer to the moment right before a locked door decides, against its own better judgment, to consider opening. "Get some sleep, Desmond," she said, and closed her eyes, the folder still resting, unopened, on the blanket beside her, hand closer to me than to the door. Outside the window, the sun was finally coming up over Route 9, and somewhere in a version of the story that no longer existed, a man named Desmond Cray had already been dead for 3 chapters. I sat in the chair Tom Aldrich had vacated, blood-lost, dizzy and bone-tired, and, for the first time since I'd woken up in this body, not remotely afraid of what came next. 6. I must have fallen asleep in that chair, because the next thing I knew the light through the window had gone from gray to full white, and someone had draped a hospital blanket over my shoulders that I certainly hadn't put there myself. Lucy was awake, propped higher against her pillows, the folder finally open across her lap, and she was watching me with an expression I hadn't yet learned to read on her face, something between curiosity and the particular wariness of a person recalculating a variable they'd been certain they'd already solved for. "You talk in your sleep," she said, before I'd even finished blinking the room into focus. "Mostly nonsense. Something about roller coasters. Once, very clearly, you told somebody named Tom to find his own leading lady. He'd crawled up the back of my neck fast enough that I didn't trust myself to answer that directly. Exhaustion does strange things to a person," I said instead, which wasn't a denial, and we both seemed to understand that. She let it go, which was its own kind of answer, and turned back to the folder instead. Pages of financial records, shipping manifests, a name I didn't recognize circled twice in her own handwriting. Whatever it was, it mattered enough that she'd nearly died rather than leave it in a burning car, and mattered enough now that reading it seemed to cost her more effort than the morphine drip was willing to spend on comfort. "Julian found you in the hallway," she said, not looking up. It wasn't a question. "You have good spies." "I have a brother who can't help but report on anyone he perceives as a threat, and a nurse who owed me a favor." Her eyes flicked up, sharp despite the exhaustion sitting heavy under them. "What did you say to him?" I considered lying. I considered, for about half a second, giving her the sanitized version, the one where I hadn't invented a quote and put it in her mouth to see what it would do to her brother's composure. But lying to this particular woman felt, suddenly and with total clarity, like the single stupidest strategic decision available to me, so I told her the truth: the account balance, the stray's comment, the fabricated quote about collecting people who think they've become indispensable. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Long enough that I started composing an apology in my head, bracing for the version of her the book had trained me to expect: cold, punitive, the villainess who didn't tolerate being used as a prop in someone else's confrontation. What she did instead was laugh. It came out rough and short, more surprised out of her than chosen, and she winced immediately afterward and pressed a hand flat against the bandages at her side, but the sound had already happened and neither of us could pretend it hadn't. "He hates being quoted," she said, once she'd caught her breath. "Especially when the quote sounds like something he'd actually think and he can't prove he didn't say it. You picked well, for a man improvising on no sleep and half his blood volume." "I have layers," I said. "New personality, remember. Still workshopping." She closed the folder, finally, and set it aside on the little rolling table beside the bed, and for the first time since I'd walked into this room she looked, not at the folder, not past me toward the door, but directly and only at me. "Layers. That's one word for it." A pause, weighing something. The diary entries were 3 years of you deciding I wasn't worth the effort of understanding. One night in a burning car doesn't erase 3 years, Desmond. I want to be clear that I know that. I know you do, I said. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking you to notice that the effort's different now, and let the rest sort itself out on its own schedule. She studied me for a long moment, the calculating stillness of someone weighing a risk against the size of the potential loss, and then, slowly, deliberately, she held out her hand not for me to take exactly, but close to the edge of the bed, an offer left open rather than extended. Thursday, she said. There's a board vote. Tom Aldrich wants a seat, and my brother wants me gone before I can stop him getting it. I'm going to need someone in that room who isn't already spoken for by either of them. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, but it's very close relative. You gave blood for me 12 hours ago without asking what it would cost you. I find I'm curious what you'd do with an actual stake in the outcome. I looked at her hand, at the bandages disappearing under her sleeve, at the sharp, careful, entirely unhated calculation still sitting behind her eyes even now, and understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with anything I'd read in 400 chapters of somebody else's book, that whatever story I was living in now, it wasn't going to end the way the original had written it. Not for her. Not for me. I took her hand. Thursday, I said. I'll be there. Outside, Route 9 was already clear of wreckage, the road crews having worked through the night, and somewhere in the city a man named Tom Aldrich was drafting paperwork for a vote he had no idea he was about to lose, and a man named Julian Whitmore was recalculating a plan that had just acquired a variable he hadn't priced in. None of them knew yet what I already did, that the Villainess wasn't supposed to die at dawn, not this time, and that I had every intention of making sure the rest of the book found that out the hard way.